Good morning, Bible class. Greetings and salutations to you, and a great big virtual hug from here at the church building as we're recording our Bible class this morning. Hope all is well with you. Don't know if it's morning or not, actually, where you're listening. Could be morning, afternoon, or evening, but wherever or whenever you're listening to this, hope all is well with you. Know God is good. Know He's blessing you. So hang in there, and hopefully we'll be able to see you at the church building before too much longer as we gather to worship and as we gather to study. Today we're going to be in chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians. So we're going to do a little brief review like we always do, and then we'll get right into chapter 10. So if you want to open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we'll get started on that right now. First, the review. In chapter 9, Paul begins the chapter by answering questions about his apostleship. Everywhere that Paul went, he was always being challenged. Are you really an apostle? And of course, he over and over again proves himself to be such. He is just as much an apostle as the original 12 that walked with Jesus. He has the same authority. He speaks with the same power, with the same abilities. He was indeed an apostle to the fullest. And so he always had to answer for that, but there was no doubt that he was. He also answered a question about payment of preachers, comparing the preacher to both oxen and to farmers. As he's making that comparison, he refers to the Old Testament, of course, and he says the Old Testament law required you not to muzzle your ox while he's treading the corn or treading the grain down, and then he would have the ability to eat while he's working. And so his work was the source of his meals. And so same thing with a farmer. A farmer plants a crop. He doesn't just plant the crop to sell. He plants the crop to be able to feed his family. So his work is his source of income. His work is the source of eating. And Paul takes those two examples and he says, if this is true of oxen and this is true of farmers, it is also true of those who preach the gospel. If they preach the gospel, if that's their only source of employment, if you will, then they should be able to earn a living by the gospel. And so it would be up to those for whom they are preaching to be able to supply the needs, physical needs of that gospel preacher. So that's the conclusion. Those who labor for the gospel should also be paid a wage from the work that they're doing. And then Paul was willing in chapter 9 to do whatever it took to gain the souls of everyone he came in contact. And he gives you a list of things there in chapter 9 that he became in order to win those people. And so to the Jews, he was a Jew. To the Gentiles, he was a Gentile. To those under the law, is under the law. To those who are not under the law, is not under the law. He just gives you a whole list of things. And then also talks about the importance of self-righteousness. And when I say self-righteousness, I'm not talking about the haughty, arrogant self-righteousness, but being righteous yourself. And he, of course, stressed the point that it takes effort. It's a challenging thing to remain pure and holy and righteous. But he lived up to that, and he encouraged everyone else to do the same. So as we get to chapter 10, begins with Paul using the history of Israel, the Jewish history, to illustrate both the need for unity and the need for obedience to God. And so that's what we're going to start with. Remember, we want to keep these thoughts in mind as we're going through our study. We're a little over halfway now, but over and over again, the same subjects keep popping up. What is it? What is it that causes disunity? It is ignorance and it is arrogance. At least that's the two main things that Paul approaches. Now, obviously, there are other things, but they all kind of sort of lead back to those two issues, ignorance and arrogance. And he has hit them hard in virtually every chapter that we've studied so far, and this chapter is not going to be any different. So in verses 1 to 4, he uses the word all 5 times. Now, notice 1 Corinthians 10, 1 to 4. Moreover, brethren, I would not that you should be ignorant. Oh, there it is, the very first line. How that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink. So for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them. That rock was Christ. Do you get the idea as he's using that word and stressing that word all in those first 4 verses, that he's talking about unity? How did the Israelites leave Egyptian bondage? Well, they all left as one. They got up, they packed up, and they moved out. And then as they wandered through the wilderness, they all wandered as one. And as they were punished by God for the sins that they committed, they were all punished by God as one. And so the unity is there in the very first part of this chapter that he's trying to get the Corinthians to see. That just as Israel was all in it together, then so the church at Corinth and so the church at Maryville is all in it together. And we need to understand and make sure that we all always understand the importance of unity wherever we are. All the fathers were under the cloud and passed through the sea. All the fathers were baptized under Moses. All the fathers in the cloud, Moses baptized Moses in the cloud and the sea. All ate the same spiritual food. All ate the same spiritual food. Drank the same spiritual drink. However, this unity did not cause them to be pleasing in God's sight. This unity alone. You can be united in righteousness just as well as you can be united in unrighteousness. And so what Paul is trying to get them to see is, even though they might attain unity, there are still hindrances to their relationship with God. And so in verse 5 he says, "But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness." So referring back to that time of the Jewish wandering in the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, he says, yes, they were united. Yes, they moved as one, but there was sin in the camp, and that sin was dealt with by God, and they were punished in the wilderness. Even though they were one nation under God, they still had their issues when it came to glorifying God. So why would Paul reference the ancients in such a way? Why would he send this letter to Corinth and talk about thousands of years ago, 2,000 years ago, roughly? And he gives you the answer to that in verse 6. "For these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted." All right, so he's telling you now that we have a negative example. We like to know what we need to be. Here's what Paul is using as what we don't need to be. So he's kind of reversing it. They're a lesson on how not to behave ourselves. That's why Paul's recording this for the Corinthians and for us as well. So in verse 7 he says, "Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer." Now, if you go back and study the events of Exodus, you find out that at the foot of Mount Sinai, when the people came to Aaron and said, "Build us a golden calf," and they donated all their gold to be able to do such a thing, that they bowed down to that golden calf and they worshiped that golden calf. And the indication is it was basically a naked orgy. They were participating in fornication and ungodliness and all kinds of wickedness there at the foot of Mount Sinai. So when Moses comes down, he has the commandments in his hands. You can understand why he'd throw them down. The shock that he must have experienced as he saw them. And of course, we know that every time they thought that they were in trouble, every time they thought they might be thirsty, every time they thought they might be hungry, they would murmur. And Paul says, don't be like that. Don't follow their example. It's a terrible example, and it's destined to bring about destruction. The Jews would have known exactly what Paul was talking about here in the references to the Old Testament. I'm just going to say the book of Exodus, okay? So, because they were guilty of idolatry, the Israelites, because of their fornication, literal fornication, not just spiritual fornication, but literal fornication, because they were guilty of tempting the Lord, because of their murmuring, they were sorely punished because of its ungodliness. And so in verse 11, now all these things happen unto them for ensamples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Now, in samples and examples, I tried to determine what the specific difference was between those two words, and the more definitions I looked up, the more confused I got. They're basically the same thing. All right. In samples is more of an older, archaic way of saying examples, but the point is clear. 2 times he says they're examples. They're examples. One of the best ways to learn how we are supposed to live is look at the mistakes others have made and refuse to imitate them. Don't go down that same road. I know as a parent, I try to help my children understand because I had made certain mistakes in my youth, and I did not want them to suffer from committing the same mistakes I had. So I said, learn from my mistakes and do better. And that is a trait I think that is common among parents. However, some of us are stubborn, and we don't want to learn from the mistakes of those who've gone before us. We like to repeat them. And Paul says, the time of repeating the mistakes of Israel is over. Don't do that. The fact that Paul repeated himself concerning the Jewish history, examples to the church of Corinth, or in samples in this verse, should show us how important he believes the point to be. Don't make the same mistakes they made. And so he says in verse 12, wherefore, let him that think he standeth take heed lest he fall. Now, if we go back to the concept of arrogance, ignorance now, they've been educated. Paul has educated them on the mistakes that Israel has made. But you go back to the concept of arrogance. Those old Israelites, how dumb they must have been, how ignorant they must have been to be falling down at the idol that they created and worshiping that idol. I'd never make a mistake like that. I'd never do anything like that. I'm just so much more intelligent. I'm so much more spiritually mature. I would never, ever, thinking that they're better than everybody else. In case someone was pointing their finger at someone else in the congregation, I'd never commit the sin that person over there is committing. Reference back to the man who had his father's wife. I'd never sin like that. That's the attitude, that's the arrogance that Paul is addressing right here. So he's already addressed ignorance, and now he's coming back to arrogance again. And so he says those who are suffering from arrogance in the congregation are pointed out and warned. Don't make the same mistakes. If you think you're something, you better reconsider. You better rethink your own opinion of yourself. Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. So go back to Paul's statement in chapter 6 and verse 13, where he said, meats are for the belly, and the belly are for meats. So the idea is food is to be eaten because my belly is designed to receive food. Therefore, my belly wants anything I want to put into it. Or I can eat anything that is classified as food as long as my belly is hungry. And so the idea is if it's food, I can eat it. I don't have to worry about it. So to a degree, that is correct. But you might also say, my fist is for punching. And since my fist is for punching, then I can use it for its intended purpose, designed for punching, to punch anybody that I don't like, or mistreats me, or is ugly to me. And so that's the same concept. Nancy Sinatra, way back in the day, dating myself here, sang a song, these boots are made for walking. Well, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to walk all over you. Is it the right thing to do? Well, probably not. But that's what they're made for, so it must be okay. That's the reasoning behind those people, or that phrase, meats for the belly, belly for the meats, and apparently the attitude that many of those who thought they were the spiritual leaders, who thought they were the spiritual mature, were taking on. The indication seems here is that some believed that they could not overcome certain temptations, or that certain temptations would not tempt them. Certain situations or circumstances would not be a temptation to them. And so he says, take heed, be careful. On the other hand, some were saying, also were thinking, that since they could not overcome them, they were thinking that they could not overcome temptations. Okay? And so if I have a temptation, it's designed for what my body is designed for, then I can't overcome it because that's the way I'm made. I just can't help it. That's the way I'm made. Well, we're hearing a lot about that these days, aren't we? How people are identifying themselves as. I just can't help it. That's the way I'm made. And so what Paul says is, that's just not the case. Just because it's a temptation, just because you're made a certain way, doesn't mean you should surrender to the flesh. And so, to answer such foolish stance, Paul says in verse 13, there is no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. And so, just like Satan knows how to tempt us, God knows how we are tempted. And just like Satan wants us to give in to the temptation, God wants us to overcome the temptation. The difference is, Satan puts the temptation before us, or uses the things that are before us to tempt us, and God says, hold on, there's a way to prevent that from happening. There's a way to keep from giving in to that temptation. And he will provide that. The problem is not that we cannot overcome temptation, The problem is that we do not seek a way of escape, and then we give in to the temptation instead. It's almost as though we want God to part the sky and snatch us away from the temptation, or snatch the temptation away from us. And that's the only way we can overcome it, if some kind of miraculous out of this world event takes place, because after all, temptation is so powerful. If all else fails, though, if we cannot find the avenue of escape, if we cannot figure it out, God tells us how to do it. If you cannot figure out a way to overcome the temptation, verse 14, wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. So he's using idolatry as a specific form of temptation because, as we know, the church at Corinth was greatly struggling greatly with idolatry. And as prominent as it was in that city, and of course the fornication that went along with that idolatry, the question about eating meat sacrificed to idols is brought up. And so Paul says, look, you don't have to give in to the temptation. If you know it's wrong and you can't figure out any other way to avoid it, run. That's how important and that's how much danger your soul is in. Run. Get away from it as far and as fast as you can. So then, starting in verse 15 through the end of the chapter, Paul's going to address this issue a little deeper. And driving home his thoughts on unity, he's going to make a reference to the Lord's Supper. So remember, as you're going through the rest of the chapter, that he's trying again to keep them unified, or to cause them to become unified, but he's also showing the importance of righteousness and overcoming temptation. So in verse 15 he says, I speak as to wise men. Judge ye what I say. All right? So they've already been claiming that they had superior knowledge, superior wisdom. So he's basically saying, well, if I'm really speaking to wise people, let the wise people judge this. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we being many are one bread and one body. For we are all, and there's his little three-letter word again, for we are all partakers of the one bread. Behold, Israel after the flesh are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar. So now he refers back to the Jewish priesthood and talks about them in their worship. And as you will remember from your Old Testament study, I'm sure that the leftovers, not everything was consumed by the fires, not everything was completely consumed by the worship act itself. The people who worked in the temple were allowed to eat from those sacrifices that were brought to the altar. So just as the Jews were united with the Lord as they ate that which was offered on the altar, Christians are united with the Lord in the partaking of the Lord's Supper. So the fact that they ate of the bread and ate of the meat of the sacrifices made them one. The Lord's Supper is supposed to unite us as well. But what about those who eat things sacrificed to idols? Okay, so that goes back to that question about eating meat sacrificed to idols. Well, if eating the Lord's Supper makes me one with the Lord, and eating the leftovers is not really a good word, but eating what was left from the sacrifices, if that makes Israel one with God, then why is it that eating meat sacrificed to idols does not make us one with idols? So verse 19, what say I then? That the idol is anything? Or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything? But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would that ye should have fellowship with, I would not, let me get it all in there, I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. So he points out a second time that the offerings to idols are nothing. However, there is a difference between eating something offered to an idol and actually participating in idolatrous worship. And so his point of reference has changed just a little bit. He's talking about the difference between getting a piece of meat that had been sacrificed to an idol and consuming it, between that and then sitting down where and when that sacrifice is made in the process of worshiping that idol, and then including yourself in the process. And so he's showing you a different angle than what he has previously discussed, showing that an idol is nothing. So there's a difference between eating something offered to an idol and actually participating in the worship of that idol. Attempting to partake the Lord's Supper while worshiping an idol is completely unacceptable. You can't be one with God and one with an idol. So, verse 21. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and the table of devils. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. So Paul repeats his comment from chapter 6, verse 12, all things are lawful for me. He repeats that here in verse 23. Once again, he explains that just because you might be able to do a certain thing without sinning, it doesn't mean you should do it. I can do a thing without sinning, yes. Does that mean I'm free to do it? Maybe. Sometimes there are some other things that have to be considered. And so in the next few verses, he explains what needs to be considered. Let no man seek his own, but another's wealth. And when he says that, he's not talking about monetary riches. He's talking about the well-being of other people, and particularly the spiritual well-being of other people. So, but every man another's wealth. Whatsoever is sold in the shambles, that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. Okay? If you see meat, you want to purchase the meat, buy the meat. Don't ask questions. You don't have to walk up and say, is this meat been sacrificed to idols? Or is this, fresh kill? You don't have to ask questions like that. You see a piece of meat, you want the piece of meat, buy the piece of meat. Okay? That way your conscience is not defiled. You can't go home and say, well, now, if I eat this, it's been sacrificed to idols, and I don't know if that's the right thing or not. If you don't know it's been sacrificed to idols, then, go ahead and eat it. For the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. If any of them that believe not bid you to eat, to a feast, and you be disposed to go, whatsoever is set before you, eat, asking no question for conscience sake. Again, when you are invited to a meal somewhere, you sit down, someone offers you a plate, you don't have to ask, is this meat been sacrificed? How rude would that be in today's society to ask, well, where did this meat come from? Can I eat this meat? Is this meat from Russia? You just don't ask that kind of thing. And that's just common sense. But he's trying to get them to see if you don't ask questions about idolatrous worship, you can't defile your own conscience. And then you don't offend anyone else either. You don't offend your host by turning your nose up to the meat. Oh, I can't eat meat sacrificed. If it is meat and you do not know its origin, eat it. Don't ask questions for your conscience sake. The condition of your conscience is important, but so is the condition of the consciences of others. So in verse 28 he says, but if any man say unto you, this is offered in sacrifice unto idols, eat not for his sake that showed it. Now notice, we're not talking about your sake anymore, we're talking about your host's sake. We're not talking about your individual conscience, we're talking about someone else's conscience. And if you want to lose some influence real quick, do something that the world thinks is ungodly and let them see you do it. Okay? Even if it might not be ungodly, do something that they perceive as ungodly and watch your influence fail. So, if he identifies, here, I'm going to serve you supper. Well, what are we having? Well, I just have this pot roast that was once offered to an idol in idolatrous worship. Don't eat that. That's a test. That's a test that man's putting you through. He may not realize it, but that's a test that individual, that host, is putting you through. For conscience sake, for the earth is Lord. Conscience, I say, verse 29. Conscience, I say, not thine own, but of the other. For why is my liberty judged of another man's conscience? However, again, if you are informed that the meat has been offered to idols, sacrificed to idols, don't eat for the sake of the other person's conscience. Verse 30. For if I by grace be a partaker, why am I evil spoken of for that for which I give thanks? Whether therefore you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. And so if you're at a person's house, a person offers you and identifies the meal as something that's been offered to sacrifice, as sacrifice an idol, you abstain. Why? Because you're trying to glorify God. And that host will say, obviously, he can't partake of this because that would make him an idolatrous worshiper. In my mind, he would be an idolatrous worshiper, even though in his mind he would not be. And the point is all boiled down to this. It's not about you. Okay? It's not about you. And that's what he's telling to the Corinthians. Corinthians, it's not about you. And that's what we need to learn in church today. It's not about you. It's about God. It's about how we glorify and honor and praise him. It is about those who are not Christians. It's about those who are weak Christians. It's about those who one day might be Christians. And so, again, it goes back to your influence. It goes back to your example. You can't follow Israel's example, but can your example be followed? Verse 32. Give none offense, neither to the Jews, nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking mine own profit. So that goes back to the wealth of others. Not seeking mine own profit, not financial, but spiritual standing, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. First and foremost, in every interaction we have, first and foremost, are we glorifying God? Right behind that, am I helping that other person gain salvation of his soul? The salvation of other people's souls are more important than any right and any freedom we have as Christians. We have the blessing of salvation, and we should be doing whatever we can, or for that matter, not doing whatever we don't need to do in order to gain others for the cause of Christ. Can you imagine standing before the Lord with someone who says, it was your example that prevented them from becoming a Christian? What kind of feeling would that put in you? It's all about living our lives in such a way that we attract others to Christ so that they may gain the salvation of their souls. And so let's look at some things we need to take away from our study of chapter 10. Number one, the things that are recorded for us in the Old Testament are there for us to learn from. There are some things that we want to follow the example of. There are some things that we want to abstain from. Don't follow the example of certain individuals. There are those examples in the Bible, in the Old Testament, of people who were just as ungodly and unrighteous as they possibly could be. Sometimes it even seems like insignificant things as we are going through and looking at them, but those very insignificant things to us were commandments that were given to those people, and they refused to be obedient to them. So make sure that when you're reading the Old Testament, first of all, is that act glorifying God? If it's not glorifying God, abstain from it. Sometimes they are examples of how we are not supposed to be. So that's number two. Number three, the nation of Israel moved and lived united as one people, even though they were 12 different tribes. Okay, so you had 12 different tribes, and when they got to the promised land, they divided up, but they were still one nation. And for a while there, they lived and acted and moved as one nation. The church is the nation of God today, and we must be united. Next lesson that we want to take away from chapter 10, sometimes the only way to overcome temptation is to run from it. And I put Joseph out there to the side so you'd see his name. I'm sure you remember how Potiphar's wife called Joseph into her bedroom and tried to get him to lie with her. And that wasn't telling a fib. She wanted to have physical relationships with him. And he said, I cannot sin against my God in such a way. And he took off running, and she reached up and grabbed his cloak, and he left it behind. So he ran. That was the only way he could get out of it. He still got in trouble, but he glorified God in the moment. He didn't get in trouble with God. And then finally, even though we might have the right to do something, if there is a danger that it will cause others to sin, we must be willing to forsake it. Remember, it's all about others, and it's not about us. It's not about me. It's not about you. It's about how I can get someone else closer to heaven. My example is essential. My example is important in the process. And when you're talking about being evangelistic, when you're talking about spreading the gospel to the world, nothing speaks louder than how you behave yourself. Whether it be righteous living or whether it be sinful living, nothing speaks louder than your example. When they see your example, remember what Jesus said. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples. Do you remember what it was? By your love for one another. By your love, men will know that you're my disciples. That's example. And that's action. And here in a couple of chapters, we'll talk about love and explain that a little bit more. But that's where we're going to end our Bible class today. I hope you got something you can study on and apply to your life. I hope you've got something that will help you become closer to what you want to be in your service to God, grow spiritually. And God bless you. Appreciate you tuning in. Again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me or text me or put them on the website there, and we'll do everything we can to answer those questions. Thank you, and Lord willing, see you next week.